There's a moment that millions of people remember exactly where they were when they saw it. A woman in her late 40s walks onto a television stage looking nervous, a little disheveled, and completely out of place. The audience starts laughing before she even opens her mouth. A judge raises an eyebrow, and then she sings, and the entire world stops. But that moment, as powerful as it was, is only the surface of this story. Because what Susan Boyle went through to get to that stage, and everything that came after it, is something far more complicated, far more painful, and far more remarkable than a single viral video could ever capture. Susan Boyle was born on April 1, 1961, in Blackburn, West Lothian, Scotland, the youngest of 9 children in a working-class household. Her father, Patrick, was a World War II veteran who spent his life working the mines. Her mother, Bridget, was a shorthand typist, a quiet, devoted woman who would become the single most important person in Susan's world. But from the very beginning, the world had already decided what Susan was. At birth, her parents were told she had been briefly deprived of oxygen during a difficult delivery. That complication led doctors to hand her a learning disability diagnosis, and for decades, Susan Boyle carried the label of brain damage. She didn't choose that label. She didn't earn it. It was handed to her before she could speak, and the people around her made sure she never forgot it. Growing up in that small Scottish town, she was bullied relentlessly. Her classmates called her Susie Simple, a nickname that followed her through school like a shadow. Every awkward social moment, every difficulty connecting with people, every time she struggled in a classroom, it all got filed under that same cruel diagnosis. Brain damaged, simple, different. What none of those doctors, teachers, or classmates knew, what Susan herself wouldn't discover for another 5 decades, was that the label was completely wrong, despite everything Susan could sing. And from a young age, that voice was the one place in the world where none of the cruelty could reach her. She began taking singing lessons with a vocal coach named Fred O'Neill, later attended Edinburgh Acting School, and sang regularly during her local church's pilgrimages. Music wasn't a hobby for Susan, it was oxygen, the only space where she felt like herself. By 1995, she auditioned for a television program called My Kind of People. 3 years after that, she quietly recorded several tracks at a small studio. Cry Me a River, Don't Cry for Me Argentina, Killing Me Softly, tracks that went nowhere, a voice that reached nobody. She kept trying. Her former coach later revealed she had abandoned an X Factor audition at some point, convinced the show selected contestants based on how they looked rather than how they sounded. Given what she'd experienced her entire life, that wasn't paranoia. That was pattern recognition. For most of her adult life, Susan lived quietly in her mother's small council home in West Lothian, surviving on welfare, singing at local events, and waiting for something that showed no sign of ever coming. She was invisible to a world that had never once looked at her properly. Then her mother got sick. Bridget Boyle had been the anchor of Susan's entire existence, the one person who believed in her daughter when nobody else did, who encouraged her to keep singing, who pushed her, finally, insistently, to audition for Britain's Got Talent, to stand in front of a bigger audience than the local church hall could ever offer. Susan had made a promise to her mom that she would do something with her life. Bridget died before she ever got to see what happened next. April 11, 2009. The BGT stage in Glasgow. She walked out looking uncertain, wearing a dress that didn't quite fit the occasion, and before she'd said 3 words, the audience was already exchanging looks. When she told the judges her dream was to be a professional singer, as big as Elaine Paige, there were audible snickers. Simon Cowell's expression said everything the cameras needed. She was 47 years old. She lived alone with her cat. She'd never been kissed. Then she started to sing I Dreamed a Dream from Les Miserables, and within seconds the entire room transformed. Jaws dropped. The audience that had been quietly mocking her seconds earlier rose to their feet. By the end of the performance, every single judge was on their feet, and Simon Cowell, a man not exactly known for sentimentality, looked genuinely moved. The video hit the internet and detonated. Within days, it had racked up tens of millions of views, at a time when that kind of number was almost unheard of. Susan Boyle became a global name overnight, going from a welfare-dependent church singer in Scotland to an international phenomenon in the space of a week. But the world had no idea what it had just done to her. The weeks that followed were brutal in ways nobody talks about enough. The pressure of the BGT competition, the cameras, the public scrutiny, the tabloids picking apart every detail of her appearance and her background, landed on a woman who had spent her entire life struggling with anxiety and isolation. Every day brought a new headline. Every headline brought a new wave of attention she had no framework to handle. She made it through to the final. She came second, losing to the dance group Diversity, and later said she hadn't really expected to win, that she'd never considered herself a champion. But what happened the morning after the final was far more serious than a runner-up placement. The day after the BGT final, Susan Boyle was admitted to the Priory, a private psychiatric clinic in London. The production company described her as exhausted and emotionally drained. Her family was more direct. She had been battered nonstop for 7 weeks, and it had finally taken its toll. The admission was significant enough that the sitting Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, publicly wished her well. Simon Cowell stepped in and offered to waive her contractual obligation to the BGT tour entirely. She left the clinic 3 days later, and then, in a move that tells you everything about who Susan Boyle is, she showed up for 20 of the 24 tour dates anyway. The woman the world had decided was fragile turned out to be one of the most quietly stubborn people in British entertainment. The career that followed was genuinely remarkable. Her debut album, I Dreamed a Dream, sold in numbers that stunned the industry. She became the oldest artist ever to reach #1 with a debut record. The albums kept coming, 8 in total, and she sold over 25 million copies worldwide, earned 2 Grammy nominations, and set 3 Guinness World Records. But behind the sales figures, something more important was happening. In 2012, at the age of 51, Susan finally sought a second opinion on the diagnosis she had carried her entire life. A specialist in Scotland evaluated her, and the result changed everything she thought she knew about herself. She did not have brain damage. She had never had brain damage. What she had was Asperger's syndrome, a form of autism spectrum disorder. And not only that, her IQ tested as above average. She went public with the diagnosis in 2013, telling a British newspaper, "I was told I had brain damage. I always knew it was an unfair label. Now I have a clearer understanding of what's wrong, and I feel relieved and a bit more relaxed about myself." Think about what that means. For 50 years, Susan Boyle had been told, by doctors, by the education system, by the label that followed her through childhood, that there was something fundamentally broken about her mind. She had been mocked, excluded, and written off based on a diagnosis that was simply incorrect. The girl called Susie Simple had an above-average IQ the entire time. She also revealed in the same period that she is epileptic, another condition that had been present throughout her life, shaping her experience in ways that had never been properly understood or acknowledged. The Asperger's diagnosis explains so much. The anxiety, the difficulty reading social situations, the way sudden fame had hit her like a freight train, the mood swings and depression she had quietly battled for years. People with Asperger's do put a barrier up because they don't know how to trust people, she said. I try not to. I want to let people in. Success brought money, and money, it turned out, brought its own kind of heartbreak. Reports emerged over the years that Susan's brother Jerry had allegedly threatened to take his own life unless she handed him $50,000. According to widely reported accounts, Susan, a woman who to this day lives on a weekly budget of a few £100s, reportedly gave her brother somewhere in the region of $400,000 over the years to help him. The relationship fractured badly. It took time, and presumably enormous patience on Susan's part, but the two eventually reconciled. She has since spoken about the resolution with genuine warmth, saying she was looking forward to the future with a happy smile. Despite accumulating an estimated net worth of around $22 million, built across 8 albums, multiple business ventures, and a touring career, Susan never moved into the posh house she bought after BGT. She gave that to her niece. She stayed in her mother's old council home in West Lothian, where she says she can still feel Bridget's presence. I felt as if the cord had been broken emotionally and I didn't know what to do, she once said about losing her mother. My weight went down and my house was a bit of a mess. I had to get social services in. I couldn't cope at all. That image, one of the most recognizable voices on the planet, sitting alone in her mother's small gray house, struggling to cope, is the one the headlines never quite captured. In April 2022, Susan Boyle suffered a stroke. She was in her early 60s, had been managing type 2 diabetes after a diagnosis that had prompted her to overhaul her diet, and was largely out of the public eye. The stroke was described as minor, but the fear it carried was anything but. For a singer, a medical event affecting the brain is not just a health scare, it is an existential threat to everything that defines you. There were real questions about whether she would perform again. She spent over a year recovering quietly, Then in June 2023, she walked back onto the Britain's Got Talent stage, this time in a sparkling midnight blue gown, and performed I Dreamed a Dream alongside the cast of the Les Miserables West End production. The audience gave her a standing ovation before she had finished. Simon Cowell told her, "If anyone was going to come back, you were going to come back, because we wouldn't be the same without you." She wrote about the performance publicly afterward, specifically noting that she had suffered a stroke the previous year and that the return to that stage meant more than anyone watching could have understood. In the spring of 2025, 6 years after her last studio album, Susan Boyle walked back into a recording studio. She had been told at some point during her recovery that she might never achieve that again. "Today was wonderful, emotional, and everything in between," she wrote. "I made my return to the recording studio for the first time in 6 years, something I was told I might never achieve again, but here we are, in my happy place." By October 2025, she was walking red carpets again, this time with a striking new look that had fans doing a double take, nearly 17 years after the audition that introduced her to the world. She still lives modestly. She still lives in West Lothian. She is never married, though she has spoken openly about hoping to find companionship. She's talked about fostering a child. She keeps her weekly spending careful and deliberate, unbothered by the millions sitting in her accounts, because the money was never the point was the singing. It was always only ever the singing. I Dreamed a Dream is a song about a woman who had everything taken from her. Her hope, her youth, her chance at the life she imagined. Susan Boyle has been performing that song for 16 years now, and every time she sings it, she is singing her own autobiography. She was misdiagnosed at birth, mocked through childhood, ignored through adulthood, and nearly destroyed by the very fame that was supposed to be her reward. She lost her mother before she could share the moment. She was admitted to a psychiatric clinic the morning after the biggest night of her life. She battled a stroke in her 60s that threatened to take the one thing she had left. And she came back, every single time. The heartbreaking thing about Susan Boyle's story isn't the struggle, it's how long she waited through it, quietly, without bitterness, in a small council house in Scotland, with a voice that the world didn't deserve to hear as early as it did. Some dreams, it turns out, are just bigger than the timeline the world assigns to them.